This is one of those concepts that you'll hear me talk about a lot, a modern machine learning workflow. When we talk about workflows, there's typically just those three steps. You'll talk about data gathering, you'll talk about development, and you'll talk about maintenance. And that's not the complete model development life cycle. It's not even the complete workflow. There's three pieces, and hopefully you've got a big enough screen to see some of my slides. You've got data research and model development. Now, when I say a modern machine learning workflow, I've built for some of the most complex machine learning use cases that are being developed today. And so the workflows that I create, I call them modern because they have to encompass a whole lot more work, a whole lot more complex flows, and larger teams. So the workflow that I'm going to present to you today and explain is far more comprehensive than what you're used to seeing because what I'm creating is more complex. And so what I end up having to support is also far, far more complex. Now, I'm not going to sell you anything, so don't expect any sort of product recommendations. I'm not going to tell you use this product for this particular step. In some cases, you're going to be building your own. There are a lot of custom stacks out there and a lot of custom components within the stack that supports the workflow. So I'm not going to get any pitchy at all with what I'm talking about. I'm going to stick specifically to steps in the workflow and what you're going to be doing at each one of those steps. When it comes to platforms and recommendations, I usually don't get into those. So my eyes are also going to be all over the place. So I apologize for that. Now you can see those three first steps hide a whole lot of detail. And you've heard of data engineering, you've heard of ML engineering, you've heard of the research side of it. You've probably heard me talk about product management, quality. All of these roles tie into these three main components and three main workflows, which allow you to build complex models in a repeatable, supportable, process-focused way. And that's what I need to explain today is all of these steps that typically do not get covered. You can see I'm going to start out with the data workflow. And when you talk about a data engineer's role, that's not the complete picture. When you just say data engineering and I'm creating a pipeline or something like that, that's not a complete role. It's not a complete description of all of the steps that are going to come into play in order to create quality data sets that you can rely on, that you can actually build models with. This is a more complete picture. If you're implementing this within a business, you need all of this. Most of these pieces are going to be critical over the next 2 to 3 years for every business. And so this is what you need to be getting ready for, whether you're just breaking into the field and you're trying to figure out what you need to learn, or if you're creating this, if you're sort of living at that architect role, or if you're a very, very senior data scientist working to build best practices into an organization, this is where you start because you have to create a structured pipeline that's a lot more complex than the as advertised. So I want to dive into the data workflow a little bit. And so I'm going to go about 2 or 3 feet deep into each one of these 7 steps within the workflow. And I want to start with data generation because why do I leave this as an open step? Because it's something that's often happening outside of the control of the business. It's outside of your control. Data is always being generated. Sometimes it's internally generated, sometimes it's externally generated, and the business is not always aware of all data that's being generated, both internally and externally. So this is a phase, is to realize that there is this thing happening which creates data, which is generating data, and it's in the next step. It's in the acquisition step that we decide, number one, to find what data is being generated, but also what data do we want to go out and get. So this is sort of the important delineation between generation and acquisition. And I don't think we talk about this as two separate phases enough. And it's very important to understand that you don't control the mechanisms of generation in every case. It's some data is not practically acquired. Even though it is being generated, you don't have the means to acquire it. Even though it is being created, you may not, there may be governance restrictions, there may be regulatory or ethical or intellectual property cost. There are considerations that come between sort of this generation and acquisition. So acquisition is the next step. And when I talk about data acquisition, I'm talking about creating processes for continuous data discovery and data cataloging. So your internal and external data discovery platform, one of them is going to be, like I said, facing internally. What data is being created and gathered by internal processes and internal groups, and what data is out there, what data is out and available. There needs to be an automated process for continually discovering that data, both internal and external. Now, cataloging happens in two ways. Again, automated and manual. So cataloging is the process of discovering it and then putting it into a categorical system, putting it into some sort of index so that we understand sort of what we have, what exists, what we can get access to. And so you have external data, internal data. You want to categorize it in categories like sensitive or restricted and give it access privileges and rights. Now, we're also going to talk about capture planning. And when you do acquisition, you want to create a plan which includes things like your pipeline platform requirements, your governance requirements, and your data reduction planning, actually making some of these massive data sets smaller because you don't want to be keeping the overhead of managing, gathering, sometimes batching, sometimes real timing, just this massive amount of data. You want to avoid that as much as possible. And then obviously, once you've done the planning, you want to do your pipeline development, which again, stream and batch processing platform, internal generation, your process for creating and gathering data from internals, and your lineage and metadata. So as you grab data, you also want to attach the metadata and lineage to it, version it, so on and so forth. So your next step is transformation. So what is transformation? Now you have data, and you typically have to do something with it to make it usable when it comes to model development, analytics, really anything that goes forward, anything that leverages that data is probably going to need some sort of transformation to facilitate it. Now that's data integration, storage platform requirements. You can hear requirements in a lot of this and planning in a lot of this. Your model requirements go into what transformations are necessary, things like data quality requirements, ground truth, ontology specs, and your sampling, what parts of the data, how much do you need? Sampling requirements go into this as well. Now, your model requirements feasibility study. Feasibility is a sort of new concept where instead of just going out and building prototyping and proof of concepting, you actually do a feasibility study. It's a whole lot faster. And you can assess model metrics. There are things like irreducible error and irreducible bias. Labor efficiency assessment goes into that. Cost of acquisition and augmentation of data, your cost of cleaning, cost of labeling goes into all of that. And so there's this concept now of feasibility that is part of your data gathering and what will you be using this data for? Can we as a business manage that? Can we do that? Your next step's familiar feature engineering. You've got preparation. You want to feature reduction, the representation side of it. You want to have quality and monitoring metrics for your features. It sounds like a thing that's going to be further down the road, but it's not. You really need to start monitoring at the feature level. Data storage, obviously your version and access control, change management. And so that's all that goes into transformation. Now, once you have transformation done, now you need annotation. It sounds like I'm trying to rhyme these. I'm not. More times than not, you need some form of annotation, whether it's just metadata and lineage, or whether there's some sort of more traditional annotation that's necessary. And so in the annotation phase, you have development, obviously your manual labeling, your auto labeling, and you want an annotated quality assessment. So basically every mechanism and individual who does annotation, you want to give each one of them a quality score and some sort of assessment that's continually happening. Like I said, similar to feature sort of quality measurements. You want to continually be doing ground truth validation. You want to test your ontologies because those can change. Those can be very complex pieces of the annotation puzzle. And you want to create an annotated data store maintenance plan. That's, ground truth requirements, change management, continuous validation, improvement, integration, and deployment. Now, next, we're going into the data quality phase. You can already hear some of the data quality happening first, but this is more of a traditional data quality phase where you're doing continuous data quality refresh, scoring, error tracking. You're executing test cases. Yes, you build test cases to test your data. That's both the pipeline side of it and the data itself to make sure it still meets all the requirements that any downstream model or dashboard has for that particular data. And that can be per project, per data set, per model. You could be even doing some regression testing, not linear regression, but more traditional quality assurance regression testing. Comparative annotation method testing, talked about that a little bit before. Your comparative data cleaning methodology testing, bias testing. This is really, really important. You can look for 3 types of bias: your pre-existing, your emergent, and your technical bias types. Next is sampling. So you have to take pieces of this data, different models, different analytics dashboards, all of the different users and consumers of data have different requirements for it. Sampling is a big part of that. So you want to do your data set split. This is where serving comes into place. You want to maintain your sampling. Your samples are artifacts and they need to be version controlled. You need to have lineage for each one of those as well. So sampling is that's sort of an administrivia step, but without it, you can lose a whole lot of information required for repeatable experimentation. And then finally, maintenance. Maintenance is a consistent theme through each one of these 3 main areas. For data maintenance is a little different. You need to do data augmentation, continually updating. So you're fixing missing data, doing basic data quality improvements, continuous production data augmentation, your continuous competitor data augmentation, catalog evaluation, and continuous evaluation and acquisition planning. Your error and failure analysis. You want to do error and failure analysis on your data set, your pipeline, ground truth, bias and fairness, and looking for things like data poisoning. And then finally, you have archiving and eventually end of life. Data doesn't live forever. At some point, you're going to want to get rid of it. You don't want to have old, stale data sitting out there and potentially not only costing you a lot of money, but also causing issues in models where people are using stale data. So you want to have some concept of end of life. This data is no longer useful. We are going to keep only what's necessary and the rest we're just going to throw out. Why? It's expensive. And so you really need to have that concept of end of life. So now I'm going to get into research. So what is a research life cycle? What does a research workflow look like? And I do applied research. So this is something that maybe you haven't seen before, but it's fairly common in the world and workflow that I live in for the most of my technical side of the job that I do. So your business case, and you'll find this in the model development workflow. And so business case and requirements are both common to research and to model development. Your business case and requirements will keep any activities that you're doing connected to the business. This is hugely important when we talk about the strategy side, when we talk about monetization and ROI. The reason why I include business case and requirements as part of the model development and research workflows is because you need that tight coupling and that tight connection, or the team is going to lose a connection to the work products that they're expected to produce and the value that they're expected to produce. And so business case is really exploring your broader business needs. What is your reuse case for specifications? What are you going to reuse the artifacts? And I'll talk about artifacts here in a second. What are you going to use the artifacts for? Because those artifacts are going to be used across projects. Research is one of the most profitable pieces of the data science sort of puzzle that a business can do. And so if you create artifacts, you want them to not only be used by one project, but be able to be used across projects so you get multiple returns on the same investment. And you also want to look at defining the competitive advantage of doing this particular research. What are these artifacts going to do to differentiate this company from all other competitors? And again, that's why one of the reasons why research is such a valuable part of the workflow is because the artifacts that it creates are competitive advantages. And so you want to define that up front to justify a whole lot of what's going to happen going forward. Ground truth definition needs to be part of the business case because typically the business will dictate or the market will dictate or customers will dictate ground truth definitions. Any sort of business needs become part of ground truth definitions. You want to define key business variables. What are the most important metrics that the business is tracking? You want to look at capabilities and then mapping the capabilities of what you're going to build to your model development. So what core capabilities are you looking to give the business and how do those map to your model development, the actual project itself? You want to do a research data pipeline requirements. Again, this goes back to the data phase that I talked about earlier. So we're defining potentially what we would do in the data phase and in the data workflow. And I want to research machine learning platform requirements. In most projects, the platform is going to be fairly static. In research, from time to time, I'm going to be doing something that's more complex, maybe something the business hasn't done before. And so I need to elaborate on the requirements for the platform that will support the work that I'm doing. In many cases, research is some of the most hardware intensive work that you do. And so there's a lot of times that you can save tons of money by implementing improvements to your platform, the platform that's going to support the research and the work that you're doing. Next is requirements gathering. So again, this is something that you'll see in the next phase as well. So I'm going to go into pretty deep detail with respect to the research phase, and you may see some changes in the model development phase when I cover that. So your first piece is validating ground truth, sort of from the business case. You want to do an internal business validation, you want to do a production validation, and you want to do a user validation. Those are your three main groups to get your ground truth requirements from. You want to do an impact assessment, production data pipeline requirements, really hardcore requirements, and then your platform requirements. Now, from that research and from that business case stage, essentially the requirements are an elaboration and validation of what you said in the business case. Data gathering just goes back to the data workflow, and that's why I put that step there. I've defined pipeline requirements. I've defined my data requirements. What data will I need to start the research workflow? And so this feeds back into the data workflow and can kick that off. Now, my model development and hypothesis phase. This is a bit different than what you're used to. Model development is often seen as kind of its own thing, happens once and then it's deployed, but that's really not how it works in more complex use cases for machine learning and building more complex models, which incorporate some sort of research phase into the process. Your model, your initial model is a hypothesis. Even your features themselves are just a hypothesis because it seems to work, it works accurately on a particular data set and distribution. However, I now have to go and do an additional step. It's not enough to just train, test, validate. I have to go out now and do an additional step, and we'll talk about what do we do after I have done a model development and created my initial hypothesis based on that model. So what are the key activities? And you're going to see these in the model development life cycle, which is the next one that we're going to cover. But in the research workflow, we do model development. We do the data pipeline development, machine learning platform development from the requirements above. We do the research model repository updates. So basically you have a repository of models that you're going to leverage and compare against each other during the research phase. It's part of the experimentation piece of this as well, to automatically compare model performance against each other. And that's all part of automated model training. So there's an automation and a manual phase for feature selection and engineering, parameter tuning. Essentially, automated model evaluation's your next step, but they all sort of sit on top of each other and feed into each other. This is just an automated, very large automated workflow, or at least as automated as possible. And so now I have from my model repository sometimes hundreds of different models and architectures. And now as I'm doing evaluation, I'm going to be running my statistical significance tests using random seeds. I've got a classifier control model for each one of the data sets. I'm doing things like uncertainty and I lost track of my train of thought there, but I'm doing a lot of different tests to evaluate models against each other and evaluate model performance against each other. Sensitivity, that was the word I was looking for. So if I'm evaluating models against each other, and in many cases, I'm not evaluating just successful. I'm sometimes modeling groups or evaluating groups of models against each other, where I have a minority opinion, which may point me at some interesting sort of interesting discovery. Discovery is too big of a word, but each one of these experimental passes, the reason why they're automated is because I am potentially doing dozens of these that don't yield anything interesting. And so I need to iterate quickly in order to find results that are interesting for manual and further exploration. Now I've done my model selection. I've found sort of this interesting model, or I've finally come through a set of several iterations to an interesting model, a model that seems to work. It seems to have learned something. And that's my model selection. Automated run artifacts. And so I'm going to build these artifacts that I was talking about that are going to move forward into the next phase. That's your code, your parameters, your input data, your evaluation metrics, output files, just this massive blob that explains what it is that I did and captures it so that it can be repeated. And now that all leads into the initial hypothesis creation. Like I said, that initial model, that model that probably combines a whole lot of interesting things that I've found over multiple iterations of model evaluation, creates my initial hypothesis. And that's where I map the business case to this initial hypothesis. How does my hypothesis support the business case, support the reason why I'm doing research in the first place? And now I'm connecting my business metrics to model metrics, or artifact metrics in this case, and mapping all of this back to this initial hypothesis. Now, the next step is experimental design. This is complicated from a workflow perspective because I have to get really creative. In most cases, I can't directly observe the system that I actually want to model. And so I have to do a whole lot of indirect things and some very extensive validation in order to create an experiment that has supportable results. And so I'm going to do things like eliminate correlation feature sets. I'm going to really get deep into potentially causal modeling or causal inference if I have enough interesting findings, I guess, or if I have enough access to the system that I'm trying to measure, or if I can prove that there is a way through indirect access to create a causal relationship. Now, my goal is to learn a function. And this is poorly understood. And so the whole point of this phase is to really learn a function, not to just learn the representation that I did in the last step where I was doing my initial model development. My hypothesis creation is really just another representation of the data set, but I'm trying to learn a function. So that's why the research workflow is different when it comes to model development than your phase that's going to come after this. I'm going to do an experimental feasibility study. Again, back to feasibility. I'm going to try to quantify uncertainty. I'm going to define what's the best outcome that I could expect from this experiment. And I'm going to map my experimental analytics to my artifact metrics. Really, so based on this experiment, I expect to be able to produce. I'm going to map that together. I'm going to need to do an additional round of data gathering. And so kind of there's a between step between experimental design and execution where I would go out and more likely than not gather additional data that would in some cases represent pieces of the experiment or be part of the experiment execution process. So I listed as kind of a middle step. Um, and I may need to redefine ground truth. I may need to really drive the data gathering by my hypothesis in the experiment and do data gathering in a very rigorous way, which is one of the main reasons why that data gathering and from data gathering all the way down to your maintenance and end of life is so important because I have to do data gathering in a very rigorous way for it to support research. Now, experiment execution. I've designed the experiment. I'm probably going to have it reviewed. And now I'm going to actually execute it. Once somebody's taken a look at my experiment and validated it and said, yeah, no, this is actually going to do what you say it's going to do. Your methodologies and foundational knowledge is sound. And so now I've got an authorization to actually go out and do the experiment. And so I'm going to create an analytics tracking dashboard for the experiment. I'm going to create my research artifacts, which are the model, my data and features, and my approved experimental steps, and then obviously the results. Now, results validation, again, another stage of oversight in the research process. And often your hypothesis design, execution, validation are iterative, where I'm going to be doing those repeatedly. And that's why I put that data gathering step kind of in between design and execution, because I'm going to be doing multiple data gathering iterations likely if I go through multiple iterations of those 4 steps. And in a lot of cases, validation leads to me going back and having to do the cycle over and over again, especially when we're talking about causal inference. There are things like counterfactuals that I probably didn't take into account that become obvious after the results have been created. And that leads through the results validation step to me going back and maybe tweaking the hypothesis a little bit based on those results or those counterfactuals, maybe redesigning the experiment or at least tweaking the experiment a little bit, maybe adding some more rigor to some of the steps, larger considerations. I might change my model uh, as a result of some of the results validation that I get. And so I want my experimental runs to be reproducible because they have to be rapidly reproducible by the validation and review team. The team review process is critical. And then finally, once I've passed validation, I can actually publish the artifacts. Those artifacts, again, are the models and unique data sets that the business will use across projects as a competitive advantage. These are unique and provide some benefit to the business over state of the art in some cases, or potentially the results are better, it's more accurate, it does things that they weren't able to do previously, it supports features or becomes a product in and of itself. And so those artifacts are meant to be used over and over again across multiple projects. Maintenance. This is, this is again common through all 3 different types of workflows. I'm going to be doing, participatory design. So I'm going to be getting participatory feedback from anything in the experiments which may have had that component to them and necessitate it. I'm going to be doing error and failure analysis, kind of that conclusion that you see in research papers where I'll say, here's my extensions of research. I may be doing additional research after the fact. I may find things that we didn't have within scope of this research project that I want to do in future projects, or this research may be something that I revisit. And so this may be something that I come back to maybe 3 or 4 months later and extend this particular research, perform further research, or redesign the experiment completely based on what we see in production. Patents and IP, obviously we do that at this phase. Artifact maintenance. We're going to continually test these models and these artifacts, especially as they have longer lifespans, sometimes 2 or 3 years, and they're reused over and over and over again. We want to be continuously testing and validating based on new information that we may have or even some other research that we may have done. new use cases may come up for it, and ground truth may need to be updated and experiments rerun as a result of it. Then obviously code maintenance, what I've actually deployed from a model perspective, we may need to update, maintain that going forward. So there's your research. That is your end-to-end coverage of the research workflow, which I don't think a whole lot of understanding or time has been spent on. Now, finally, the model development workflow is something that you're probably pretty familiar with this. Business case I've already gone over, but I'm going to do this really quickly just to make sure I haven't missed anything with respect to model development that is different than from research. So obviously your use case definition, your mapping of artifacts of model metrics to your business metrics. You're going to validate research artifacts in this phase. So again, another phase of validation to make sure that the artifacts still align with the existing business case as it may have been redefined. Your pipeline requirements, platform requirements, impact assessments, so on and so forth. Requirements gathering is very similar again to what I've outlined before. You've got a little bit of a different target audience. You've got user requirements, integration requirements, functional requirements, and test case creation. So still requirements gathering, still fairly well understood here. So I'm not going to spend too much time with requirements. Your product model development is very similar to what I went over in the research phase. You have your pipeline development, platform development, model repository updates, automated model training. Again, very, very similar to what was done before. Your automated evaluation, selection, automated runs, and then finally, capturing those artifacts of all those automated runs that you're going through and iterating through. And it's the same thing, code parameters, input data, evaluation metrics, output files. Now you're going to do a model quality phase here, which is different than in the research phase. In the research phase, you're really more interested in research quality, experimental design, and results validation, whereas now we're doing more of a traditional quality assurance, machine learning quality assurance role, where we've created a testing framework. And that's, you define and continuously update the tests and the pass-fail criteria. You've got continuous testing on your data sets. This ties back to that initial workflow. Your simulated production environment test cases, sort of a mid-step between development and deployment. User acceptance testing and your adversarial machine learning or robustness testing. Your performance versus competing and reference models. So what is the in-place solution and how does this particular model perform compared to your in-place solution, compared to whatever it is that exists. Basically, you're validating that what you've created has some higher value over replacement. So you've actually achieved something. You've built a model that does something better, and it's not some random chance. It actually does something better than what's available right now or what's in production, or maybe even some competing models. You want to do your lifetime costs, project metrics, reliability, your integration, all of that, functional testing, and then obviously regression. Finally, release. You're doing a structured deployment process, and this is more software engineering best practices. So you've got role-based access, you've got an approval workflow, you need to do integration, which is your operational validation, and then long-run testing. You may do SOAK testing. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore. And you're testing at scale. So you're now getting ready. In many cases, you're staging, which is the next phase, and then finally deployment into production. And that's your release phase. Finally, maintenance. What you're doing here, again, error and failure process. You're catching different types of failure categories and severities. In a lot of cases, you need to define this. So you've got things like bias, model drift, misalignment, explainability, maybe even adversarial. Not all models are exposed to adversarial, but it's worth knowing and noting. You want to have a process for detection and analysis. Continuous testing. So you've got continuous retraining and model selection, which in most companies now is just an automated process with maybe some flags or logging that are sent out. Competitor model performance. So you're looking at how your shop compares to other shops. There's a strategy component to this, and so it's important to gather. You want to do regression, and finally, end of life. Yes, models die. Models have an end of life. They are taken out of circulation. So you want to have an end of life plan. What happens when this model no longer performs up to the business needs? What will replace it? Or what are we going to end of life? In some cases, products are just end of life. And so there is no longer support for them. They're no longer being sold. And that could be part of an end of life plan. So hopefully this has been a more comprehensive view of the machine learning, data science umbrella workflows and a more sophisticated, more modern approach to workflows than you may be used to.